Kairate friends, welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Marc Graves, and today we're talking about homelessness in the ancient world. Homelessness was a very common issue that people had to deal with in the ancient world, but it's not one that got written about a lot. Most people who were writing stuff about science and epic and wars and politics and stuff. So we just have to pick out a few nuggets that do exist. For instance, Martial wrote a poem in which he has a little scene of a beggar who is dying in the street while at the same time fending off wild dogs, so pretty brutal there. There are several cases in the epidemics, which were probably written about 400 BC, that these epidemics have lots of case studies of different people struggling with different diseases, and several of these include people that seem to be homeless. So for example, there's a girl in Abdera, who I believe is nameless, who lay sick by the sacred way for 27 days. And then also Anaxion, also of Abdera, who lay sick of acute fever by the Thracian gate for 34 days. So it sort of implied that they are begging during this time period, so they're able to get enough food to sort of survive for a short period of time, but not for very long. And then the wife of Deliarches in Thasos, who lay sick on the plain with acute fever and mental disturbance. So several people who are dealing with disease and also trying to survive and being exposed to the elements. Then Scobie's article, Slums, Sanitation, and Mortality in the Roman World, goes even more in-depth into these sources, more in-depth than I had time for, so I'm going to read a quote from his article for you really quickly. Several ancient sources refer to huts erected against or on top of public buildings or between the columns of porticos in front of shops. Such structures were likely to be demolished from time to time by city officials. The destitute also found refuge in tombs, which also served on occasion as improvised brothels and lavatories, and others slept in spaces under the stairs of insulae, which are apartment buildings, in underground cellars, vaults, or in the open air. So there's a whole lot of information that he has for us there about where people might live and get by. And then he goes on to add even more to this. So he talks about where they might get food from. So for instance, the ones who are living in the tombs or the graveyards might have opportunity to have little gardens where they could grow some food to help them get by. And then they might access the local either cafes or street vendors. So these were both considered very low class. Somebody like Cicero would never patron these, but if you were homeless or a day laborer or just very low class, you would frequent these places. And he even mentions some of the foods that you might get there. So things that are actually, although very cheap, fairly filling and sustaining. So things like different kinds of sausage and blood puddings, which sounds kind of gross, but also you would get iron and protein from that at least, so not terrible. And then, as I mentioned, they could get a little supplemental nutrition from their gardens. So as you can tell from the quote I read earlier, there was not a lot of help for you if you were homeless. The most that the local authorities might do was come through and clear out all the tents and shelters that you had built, shoo you out of public areas. So not a lot of help there until Christianity comes around. That's actually a big game changer. And there's a great book on this written by Fern Gren called Medicine and Healthcare in Early Christianity. So this happened mostly around the Roman Empire, obviously. And even in Christianity's earliest form, it wanted to give to the poor, right? So they would give meals every Sunday, that sort of thing. And then as Christianity grew, this institution of giving to the poor just increased and grew along with it. So there were whole orders of clergy dedicated just to serving the poor and to specific jobs even within that category. So they might take out meals every Sunday. They might also take basic medical care, right? There weren't a lot of professional physicians doing this, but you might take just sort of basic home remedy type of stuff. And even if you're bringing food and water, keeping them hydrated, that can help a lot when you're sick, obviously. And there was a whole subgroup of these clergy, apparently called the Spudaioi, and they would dig graves. That was their only job, was to dig graves for people who were too poor to afford their own grave or funeral. So a lot of service happening there. And then in 390, there was a lady called Fabiola, and apparently she was quite the gal. She had a mind of her own. She was also a noblewoman, so she had a lot of power and wealth to throw around, and she used it in benefit of Christianity and the poor. So she instituted the first public hospital, which is super cool. Before this point, there had been some things that maybe kind of hinted at maybe thinking about a public hospital, but this is the first real deal, the first real thing to come along. And she was a friend of St. Jerome's, and Jerome bragged about her that her hospital had become famous from the East all the way to Britain. And all this charity on the part of the Christians really annoyed the secular authorities of the time. So the Emperor Julian, who is famously nicknamed Julian the Apostate, right? Because he was the first non-Christian emperor to come along in a while, and because he hated Christianity and was always complaining about it and giving it a hard time. He famously said that the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us. So he's annoyed that the Christians are making him look bad because they're giving to the poor and he's not. And he basically starts to set up pagan charitable organizations and to restructure pagan priesthoods so that there is more charity going to the poor to try to win people back over from Christianity. Thank you so much for checking out this video on homelessness in the ancient world and how people who are in that situation either try to deal with it, and then how people on the outside either helped or hindered, right? So thank you again, and a special thank you to subscribers and to patrons. I hope to see all of you again next week. Kairete.